Good morning, everyone. So I wanted to thank, again, the Iran Tribunal for the invitation to be here, and just go ahead and get started. In 1986, Reynaldo Galindo Pol from El Salvador was appointed the Special Representative on Human Rights, on the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran by the United Nations. In his 1988 report, he wrote that he met with approximately 20 people who witnessed and experienced ongoing atrocities in the country. Among the testimonies he reported was this one. Mr. Baumann stated that while he was in prison, some 90 prisoners were executed in one night, in 3 successive groups of 30. He later learned that the number of persons executed that night had reached 155, and that they were all buried in a mass grave. He personally knew a prisoner who was executed who was 65. By 1987, the policy regarding execution of prisoners had changed, and that prisoners were no longer executed in even prison, but in various houses in town. In 1989, the Special Representative Pol reported more accounts and attached the names of several hundred political prisoners to his UN report. Among the accounts was the following testimony. According to the witnesses, families, and relatives were frequently not told the whereabouts of places of burial, and on several occasions, protests by families led to further arrests. From 1988 onwards, several families of female political prisoners had received from administrative officials a certificate of marriage of their imprisoned daughters. These certificates concerned female prisoners who had allegedly been raped before execution. In that same 1989 report, Special Representative Pol draws attention to the fact that the human rights situation showed no progress in Iran. He requested the Iranian government to change penal norms in the country and to conduct a scrupulous investigation of all allegations of human rights violations that have occurred. In 1990, the Special Representative provided this account in his report to the General Assembly. Mr. Bourbour stated that in August 1988, 30 political prisoners had been transferred from Bandar Azali to Rasht prison in the north of the country. Their relatives had been worried about the transfer and had asked the prison authorities why prisoners had been moved. The authorities told them that there was no cause for alarm, but the following December, the relatives received the clothing and other belongings of the prisoners, together with notification that they had been executed. During this time in Iran also submitted and on occasion met with the Special Representative regarding the Human Rights Commission's mandate. The government gave reasons why such events could possibly be taking place in the country, although they denied it. The statements submitted by authorities every year could be reduced to 3 general themes. First, because the government followed Islamic law, there was, as they put it, selective adherence to certain provisions of international human rights instruments because of the problems of compatibilities between the 2 bodies of law. The second and third themes put forth by the government were that the international war of 8 years' duration and the revolutionary process under harassment and threats from terrorists and subversive groups. As most of us know, nothing was done to address the political atrocities that took place in Iran during the 1980s. The regime and that political philosophy of repression continued to hold power. The world knew about it as the reports continued to be sent to the United Nations throughout all that time period, and other countries continued to monitor Iran and did nothing to encourage addressing the wrongs. The world's focus then shifted to other brutal campaigns led in countries such as Iraq, the Balkans, and Rwanda. The situation in Iran seemed to have all been but forgotten. If the UN had been aggressive about its response in demanding justice for victims, as they have been in other cases, could this have addressed the root cause or alleviated the suffering that Iranians face today as a result of their justice system? Could early intervention have reformed the rule of law or changed the regime's behavior? I ask this because today, the same mentality of preventing and stifling dissent still pervades the country, despite, quote, the wave of hope that accompanied the victor of Hassan Rouhani. As Karim Lahiji, the president of the International Federation for Human Rights, described, executions, torture, and imprisonment are just as prevalent in today's Iran as the Iran of Ahmadinejad, and Rouhani's numerous electoral promises concerning the rule of law and freedom of press, of opinion, of assembly, and of association remain unfulfilled. The right to a fair trial continues to be systematically violated, and the courts increasingly hand down the death penalty, most often for cases of drug trafficking. Thousands of people, including many members of ethnic communities such as the Balochs, the Kurds, and Arabs, are on death row in Iran. Despite a lack of transparency and an absence of official public records of executions, many death sentences are carried out, often publicly. 2013 was a record year in the past decade with over 700 executions, including at least 8 minors. 2014 looks to be following the same trend, with more than 330 executions, including 7 minors, having taken place since the beginning of the year. So to an outsider like myself, with no familial ties or connection to Iran, but as a legal practitioner of international criminal law and human rights, it comes as no surprise to me that a movement would be born to address the atrocities that occurred in Iran in the 1980s. In 2007, with the first meetings underway of what became known as the Iran Tribunal, people decidedly took matters into their own hands. Despite the ups and downs of its formation, by 2011, a plan of action was in place to make the tribunal a concrete reality. By 2012, the Iran Tribunal was already underway, hearing testimony and issuing its determination of the culpability of the Iranian government in the atrocities that took place in the 1980s. I want to spend some time now highlighting what I find to be the most important contributions of the Iran Tribunal. And I know that it may sound premature because the judgment has only been out for 2 years, but I believe that there are some important contributions that have been made by the tribunal, both on a local and international level. The Iran Tribunal is a successful example of a grassroots movement which incorporated the rule of law and centered on survivors, witnesses, and the families of the victims. Key ingredients to a peaceful society are strong national and local judicial systems which promote and protect human rights. It is therefore important that the judiciary of any national system is independent. It is even more important that victims have the ability to come forward to seek redress for their grievances. When the judiciary fails to provide necessary security for people, it allows a space to be created where society can fail. When larger atrocities like genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes occur, the international community has been quick to offer the International Criminal Court or other similar ad hoc mechanisms as a solution. Unfortunately, I believe this is sometimes short-sighted and not a solution which considers the victims or the future of the people. Even in instances where the response is positive by these larger institutions, there is a large disconnect between international justice and local justice. Sometimes the actions of these entities do not necessarily translate into something that can be used for local societies. Local judiciaries who interact with civil society on a daily basis are in need of attention and desperate reform in many cases, because they perpetuate the same political, racial, and socioeconomic policies that created the atrocities to begin with. What we should avoid is creating a large distance between people and their historical narrative when we flex our judicial muscles. This has to be in tandem with addressing the crimes that have occurred and punishing perpetrators. Perpetrators are quick to take notes on how sitting heads of states are avoiding international prosecution. A recent example of this is the African Court of Justice and Human Rights, which gives immunity from genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes for sitting heads of African states. This was done, in my opinion, in direct retaliation for the ICC's investigations in Africa. We have unfortunately allowed the national rule of law to take a backseat to international entities. This is unforgivable. It is the obligation of a state to ensure that citizens can trust their courts to carry out rigorous investigations into atrocities, no matter how powerful the perpetrator. Human rights are a cornerstone and should never be negotiated, regardless of differing legal philosophies, terrorism, or war. Iran has always had this obligation to its people, and this is an obligation that the international community should insist that Iran meet. I say this because I know that the people who participated in this movement understand that glamorous entities like the United Nations did not come to the rescue when they were needed. The politics behind international justice has become another obstacle that victims have to overcome in order to be heard, which is far from just. One notable example is the stateless people of Burma, the Rohingya, where the authorities of Burma are continuing to pass genocidal laws intent on removing the group from its home. The UN considers the Rohingya the most persecuted ethnic group in the world, yet nothing is done. Is economic trade with Burma more important than the lives of an ethnic group which possibly could be eradicated and taken from their home? While I believe that an international justice system is absolutely necessary and that it can send a deterrent message when used correctly, movements such as the Iran Tribunal fulfill the role of an absent independent judiciary in countries like Iran that has perpetuated systemic and gross violations of human rights in violation of international human rights law and Islamic law. Further, the Iran Tribunal and movements like it allow for a more informative critique of the reforms that national and local systems need. These critiques, when they come from the inside and from victims themselves, create a better picture of what reforms are truly needed and what is needed to heal victims and move society forward. While this may not have been the direct goal of the tribunal, it is the effect that will likely occur when more people begin to study and see the repeated pattern of abuse and systemic human rights violations. Now, thanks to the hearings of the tribunal, there is a record of these violations. Another contribution that the tribunal sheds light on is an important aspect of history that fundamentally changes the views that newer generations in Iran will have of its history. While there are differing viewpoints on what occurred, the Iran Tribunal carved out a historical space for this narrative. As Shukfe Saki, a PhD student in Canada who testified at the tribunal, stated, "For the first time, people in Iran, especially the younger generations, are finding out what happened in the 80s and can see how the past still informs the present. What happened in the 80s doesn't belong to the people of the 80s. It laid down the foundations of where these young people were born. They were born in a climate of fear and oppression, and they were used to it and accept it, but the roots for the present situation have to be found in the massacres of the 80s. Further, the Iran Tribunal re-engages the human rights issue as it has remained neglected. As Professor Payam Akvan noted in a New York Times interview, there is a notion that Iran is being viewed exclusively through the prism of the nuclear issue, and human rights matters are the last thing on the minds of policymakers. It's once again for the Iranian people to make human rights the central issue for the future of Iran. The crimes against humanity which occurred in the 1980s are something that civil society is starting to express interest in. One notable example is Shadi Sadr and Shadi Amin, who are putting together a three-part series beginning with the 1980s on sexual abuse.
I'm sorry for interrupting. Would you mind speaking a little less
fast? Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. Okay.
Take the points.
Okay.
They're all extremely important.
Yes.
Unless you go more slowly, we can't.
I will slow down, sorry. Somebody should have raised their hand. Okay, I'll just start from, okay. Further, the Iran Tribunal re-engages the human rights issue as it has remained neglected. Okay, the crimes against humanity which occurred in the 1980s are something that civil society is starting to express interest in. One notable example is Shadi Sadr and Shadi Amin, who are putting together a three-part series beginning with the 1980s on sexual abuse in the prisons of Iran. Their purpose is so that dialogue increases on this particular subject and that impunity no longer reigns in Iran. These kinds of actions, whether large or small, all come together to create a reform born from civil society instead of one that is top-down and from people who are far removed from the situation to understand the needs of the people. Finally, the tribunal proves that justice is not a one-size-fits-all formula. This is something the Iran Tribunal has in common with people from other parts of the world. One of the best examples is in Brazil, where, working with the support of the Catholic Archbishop of Sao Paulo and the World Council of Churches, a team produced the report Nunca Más, which analyzed military records and the use of torture under the dictatorship between 1964 and 1979. While these movements are independent of state action, there is no denying the value of what these movements produce. The Iran Tribunal, just like these other movements, is a diamond in the rough. Before I conclude, I want to leave you all with some things to consider. Every movement centered on finding justice needs to continue to move forward. As this conference proves, just because there are findings, it doesn't mean the conversation should stop. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, "As my sufferings mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways in which I could respond to my situation, either to react with bitterness or to seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I chose the latter course." I encourage the Iran Tribunal to continue with educational seminars, publications, and documentaries about the events that took place in Iran, because they are significant learning tools, and it is even more critical in a time when the government continues the same behavior and denies what it has done in the past. I encourage Iranian diasporas all over the world to memorialize the events of the 1980s so that younger generations understand the importance of hope, the rule of law, and justice. Yesterday, at the Truth and Telling and Impunity Conference at Gresham College, Sir Jeffrey Nice said that the internet can change things, and can change things done in a way we won't expect. So Iranians have an opportunity to re-engage their history, and more importantly, encourage and advocate for change, whether they are in Iran or not. I encourage the tribunal to continue to create partnerships so that your message can be amplified, because in these proceedings and in partnerships, the seeds of change will be planted and will continue to bear fruit. I want to encourage the tribunal to also continue to engage the international community on its judgment and process. These crimes that occurred in the 80s are still happening today. Engaging Iran despite its denial is also important. I know that this may sound unrealistic to expect change, but it can happen. In April 2014, the Prime Minister of Turkey offered an unprecedented condolences to the families of those who died in the Armenian genocide. He also said that he would set up a historical commission to investigate the events. Turkey still denies the Armenian genocide took place, and while many wonder whether his words are hollow and if Turkey will follow through, it is a positive step in a better direction. Recognition can never come too late. There are so many people in the world that do not have a scrap of justice within their reach after an atrocity takes place. The model of the tribunal is one that many other places in the world could use and learn from. Congratulations on finding the strength, despite the hurdles, in creating an opportunity for justice to take the lead. I want to end again by thanking the members of the Iran Tribunal, especially Mr. Babak Ahmad and Mr. Hamid Sabi, for their most gracious invitation to come and speak. This opportunity means so much to me, and to be able to speak about this movement such as this is truly an honor. I would also like to thank all those who came forward to share their suffering. As a former domestic prosecutor in the US, I know it's never easy to relive those moments, but I want you to know that there are many people like me in the world who appreciate and have learned so much from your bravery in sharing your experiences. Your message has not fallen on deaf ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much.